My daughter looked across that restaurant table, smiled at her colleagues, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, don't mind her. She's just my mother. She still clips coupons and buys her shoes at Goodwill." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, exactly, that's the worst kind. It was the polite, cocktail party kind that people use when they're uncomfortable, but don't want to seem rude. A few people glanced at me, then quickly away. One woman, young, expensive earrings, the kind that cost more than my monthly electric bill, pressed her lips together in something that wasn't quite a smile. I sat at the end of that long table in my navy cardigan, the one I'd worn to church for 11 years, and I didn't say a word. I simply folded my hands in my lap, the way my mother taught me to when I needed to keep myself from speaking. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 67 years old, and that evening in a rooftop restaurant in downtown Nashville, my daughter, Lauren Whitfield, made me feel like a stain on her tablecloth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how grief works sometimes. It pulls you straight to the wound before you've had time to explain how you got it. Let me start where things actually began. I live alone now in a small brick house on Clover Hill Road in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Franklin, my husband of 38 years, passed 4 years ago this past October. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. The doctors said it was fast. Like that was supposed to be a comfort. Maybe it was. I still haven't decided. After he died, the house got very quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not silent. There were still birds and the neighbor's wind chimes and the hum of the refrigerator at night. But quiet in the way that only happens when the person who always knew where you were stops knowing. When nobody checks anymore. Franklin used to leave the hall light on if I was the last one to bed. For 3 months after he passed, I kept turning it off before I realized there was nobody left to leave it on for. Lauren is our only child. She was 34 when her father died, already married to her husband, Derek Whitfield, already managing her career in corporate consulting, already moving through a world where people wore watches that cost more than used cars and called it networking. She cried at the funeral. Genuinely, I think. Lauren has always been more complicated than people give her credit for. She loved her father in her way. She just didn't know how to love the things that reminded her of where she came from. The distance between us didn't happen all at once. That's something nobody tells you about estrangement. It's rarely a single door slamming. It's more like a window left open in winter. The cold comes in so slowly you almost convince yourself you're imagining it. The first time I noticed something shift was about 8 months after Franklin passed. Lauren called to tell me she'd been promoted to regional director. I asked if that meant longer hours. She said, "Mom, why is that always your first question?" I didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, so I said I was proud of her, which I was. We hung up a few minutes later. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after. By the second year, she called on Sundays out of what felt like obligation rather than desire. I could hear it in how quickly she answered my questions, like she was checking items off a list. Health, fine. House, fine. Weather, fine. Okay, Mom, I have to go. Derek's waiting. Derek Whitfield. I tried with Derek, I truly did. He wasn't a bad man, exactly. He was the kind of man who made you feel vaguely judged for things you hadn't done yet. At family dinners, the few we had, he had a way of steering conversation toward things Lauren and he had done, places they'd been, people they knew. He once spent 20 minutes explaining a ski resort in Colorado to me, in the tone people use with elderly relatives who've never heard of electricity. Franklin never trusted Derek entirely. He never said so directly, but I could tell. He had a way of growing quieter around people he didn't trust, a kind of careful stillness. The last Christmas before he got sick, after Lauren and Derek had left and we were washing dishes together, Franklin said without looking up from the sink, "She's happy, I think." I just hope happy is enough. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. About a month before the dinner that changed everything, Lauren called on a Wednesday afternoon. That alone surprised me. Wednesdays weren't part of our routine. "Mom." Her voice had an energy I hadn't heard in a while. Not warm, exactly, but animated. Lit up by something. "Hi, sweetheart. Derek's firm is doing a dinner next month. A celebration, actually. He just made senior partner. We're hosting it at Magnolia Rooftop." A pause. "I'd like you to come." I set down the dish towel I'd been folding and sat at the kitchen table. Something about the invitation felt slightly off-center, the way a picture hangs almost level but not quite. Still, I ignored the feeling the way you do when you want badly enough to believe something. "I'd love to come," I said. And I meant it. "Lauren, that's wonderful news for Derek. She stopped. "Dress nicely, okay? These are important people." I told her I would. I almost asked what she meant by nicely, but I stopped myself because I was afraid of the answer. After we hung up, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The light through the kitchen window was the long, golden kind you only get in Tennessee unless in late September. Franklin would have said it looked like something worth painting. I thought about what to wear for 3 days. That probably sounds trivial. It wasn't. When you're 67 and you've spent the last 4 years, mostly in garden clothes and church dresses, your wardrobe doesn't exactly offer much in the way of options. I had one dress I considered genuinely presentable, a deep green wrap dress I'd bought for my nephew's wedding 2 years earlier. I'd only worn it once. I took it to the dry cleaner on Tuesday. I asked them to press it carefully. The young woman at the counter barely glanced up. I wore my pearl earrings, the ones Franklin bought me for our 25th anniversary at a little jewelry shop in Gatlinburg. I remember him asking the salesman if they were the real kind, and the salesman hiding his smile while answering yes. Franklin paid in cash. He always paid in cash for things that mattered. I drove myself to Nashville. I'd offered to take a bus. The drive makes me nervous at night, but Lauren had said she'd arrange a car, and then apparently forgotten. I didn't bring it up again. Mothers learn to let certain things pass. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a hotel downtown. All glass walls and Edison lights strung over exposed wood beams. The kind of place that makes you instinctively quiet your voice when you walk in. I gave Lauren's name at the elevator. The young man pressed the button without making eye contact. The rooftop was already full when I arrived. Long tables draped in white linen, candles in low glass holders. A bar along one wall where young professionals stood with cocktails, and that particular brand of comfortable noise that comes from people who've never had to think too hard about money. I spotted Lauren near the center of the room. She looked beautiful. She always does, even when I'm angry at her. She'd inherited Franklin's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on the light. Tonight she wore a black dress, and her hair was down, and she was laughing at something a tall man was saying, with the kind of ease that takes years of practice to cultivate. She saw me. The laugh didn't stop exactly, but something behind her eyes did. She crossed the room toward me. Her hug was brief and sideways. "Mom, you made it." She glanced at my dress, just for a second, but I caught it. "Your hair looks nice. Thank you. You look beautiful." She guided me toward the main table with one hand barely touching my elbow. "Derek's in the middle of something. I'll introduce you in a bit." Derek Whitfield found me about 15 minutes later. He shook my hand with the particular handshake of men who've been to seminars about handshakes. Firm, brief, the kind that communicates hierarchy without saying anything. "Dorothy. Not Mom. Never Mom. Good of you to make the drive." "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. "Congratulations on senior partner, Derek. Your dad would be proud." Something flickered across his face. I'd made a mistake. His father was a complicated subject. I knew that. I'd simply forgotten the way you forget landmines when you've been away from the field long enough. "Right," he said. "Excuse me." And he was already moving. I found my place at the table. It was near the end, not the far end where they'd put overflow guests, but near enough to it that I understood the message. Lauren sat near the center, beside Derek, 3 seats away from me with 2 of their colleagues between us. The woman to my left introduced herself as Priya. She was warm and quick-eyed and spent the first 10 minutes asking me genuine questions about Murfreesboro, which I wasn't expecting. I liked her immediately. The man on my right talked to the person on his other side for most of the evening. The food was extraordinary, the kind of dishes where you're not entirely sure what you're eating but feel wrong asking. I ate carefully. I smiled at the right moments. I listened more than I spoke, which has always been my particular talent. Then, about halfway through the main course, Lauren's colleague across the table, a man named Garrett, late 30s, the confident kind, asked her how long she and Derek had been in Nashville. 6 years, Lauren said. "We moved from Memphis right before we got married." "Where'd you grow up?" Garrett asked, a fraction of a pause. "Murfreesboro." "Oh, nice." Garrett looked toward me. "Is that where your mom's from?" And then Lauren smiled, that particular social smile, the one she'd learned somewhere along the way that meant she was managing a situation, and said, "Yes, Mom's still out there. She's very rooted." A light laugh. "She clips coupons and buys her shoes at Goodwill. Can't quite get her to upgrade." The laughter that rippled around her end of the table was polite and amused and utterly unself-conscious. The kind of laughter that doesn't know it's drawing blood. I set down my fork very carefully. Priya glanced at me. She was the only one who did. I looked at my daughter, who was already moving on to the next sentence of a different conversation, and I thought about Franklin at the kitchen sink saying, "I just hope happy is enough." And I thought about the dry cleaner pressing my dress, and the pearl earrings from Gatlinburg, and the 2-hour drive I'd made alone at night, on a highway that made me nervous, because my daughter had forgotten to arrange a car. I didn't cry. I'm not sure I even felt anger yet, not the hot kind. What I felt was colder and older than anger, the particular grief of finally seeing something clearly that you'd been choosing not to see for years. I reached into my purse, which was, admittedly, not designer, and which I had polished with leather conditioner the night before because it was the best I had. I found my phone, and I texted a man named Raymond Beckett. "Raymond," I wrote, "I think it's time to move forward with what we discussed." The reply came in less than 2 minutes. "I'll make the calls first thing tomorrow," he wrote. "Are you certain?" I looked at my daughter laughing at the center of that table. "Yes," I wrote back, "I'm certain." I put the phone away. I picked up my fork. I finished my meal. I smiled at Priya, who was telling me about her mother's garden in Chennai with an affection that made my chest hurt a little. I stayed for dessert. I said goodnight to Lauren with a kiss on her cheek and told her it had been a lovely evening, which was not entirely a lie, because some things can be both lovely and devastating at once. I drove home in the dark, both hands on the wheel, and I let myself cry for exactly one stretch of highway, between 2 exits, and then I stopped, because I was turning onto Clover Hill Road, and I didn't want to arrive home crying. Franklin always said you should try to arrive places composed. He wasn't sure why, but he felt it mattered. Raymond Beckett had been Franklin's attorney for 22 years. He was 71 now, semi-retired, still sharp in the precise and unflashy way of men who've never needed to prove anything. He'd sat at our kitchen table for holiday dinners more times than I could count. He'd stood in our front pew at Franklin's funeral, one of 6 pallbearers, and cried without wiping his face. What Lauren didn't know, what I had never told her, and what Raymond had quietly kept from becoming public, was this. Franklin had not died the way Lauren assumed he had. Financially, I mean. Lauren knew about the savings, the modest retirement account, the little brick house on Clover Hill Road. She knew her father had worked 31 years as a civil engineer for a county infrastructure firm, and she'd long ago categorized us as comfortable but not wealthy, the kind of solid lower middle-class background she'd been working her entire adult life to put behind her. What she didn't know was that Franklin, quiet, cash-paying, no seminars, necessary Franklin, had spent the better part of 2 decades making very patient, very careful investments in commercial real estate across Middle Tennessee. Not flashy, not risky, just steady. He'd started with a single property, a small strip of retail space in Smyrna that a friend's brother was desperate to sell. And over the years, slowly, without drawing attention to it, he'd built something that even surprised me when Raymond laid it all out 6 months after Franklin passed. "Dorothy," Raymond had said, sitting across from me at that kitchen table with a folder in his hands. "Franklin wanted me to wait until you'd had some time. He didn't want you making decisions in grief." He paused. "You are, to put it plainly, a wealthy woman." I remember staring at him for a very long time. I knew about some of the properties, not all of them. Franklin was a man who believed that financial information shared carelessly caused more problems than it solved. He'd seen it happen in other families. He'd been deliberate about protecting me from the specific kind of pressure that comes when people start calculating your worth. He'd left everything in a trust, carefully structured, with Raymond as trustee and me as sole beneficiary. He'd also included a provision that I found both heartbreaking and entirely characteristic of him. If I chose to, I could bring Lauren into the trust. But only when I was confident she'd receive it as a gift rather than an entitlement. I had spent 4 years trying to determine which it would be. The morning after the Nashville dinner, I sat in my kitchen with coffee in Franklin's old mug, the blue ceramic one from a hardware store he'd loved because it held heat longer than the fancy ones, and I called Raymond back to talk through the details. It wasn't revenge I was after. I want to be careful about that, because when I tell this story, I can see how it might read that way. But it wasn't. What I wanted was honesty. What I wanted was for my daughter to know the truth of who her parents were before she spent the rest of her life being ashamed of the wrong things. Raymond had been in conversation for several months with a development group that was acquiring properties for a large mixed-use project in Williamson County. 3 of Franklin's parcels sat directly in the path of the proposed development. The offer on the table was significant, the kind of number that changes the shape of things. What I'd asked Raymond to hold on, to wait, was whether to proceed quietly or to bring Lauren in before the deal closed. I'd been undecided. I wasn't undecided anymore. 3 days after the dinner, Lauren called on a Sunday. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was slightly guilty about something, but not ready to address it directly. "How are you feeling, Mom? The drive home wasn't too much." "The drive was fine. You seemed quiet at the end of the evening." "I was tired," I said. Which was true, just not the complete truth. A pause. "Derek thought it went well." "I'm glad to hear that." Another pause. Lauren has always struggled with silence on the phone. It makes her fill the space. "The food was good, right? The lamb was supposed to be really, Lauren." My voice was steady. I'd had 3 days to decide how to say this. "I'd like you to come to Murfreesboro next weekend. I need to talk to you about something. Is everything okay?"
"Are you sick?"
"I'm fine, I just need to talk to you. Bring Derek if you'd like." She said she'd check with Derek. She called back Tuesday to say they'd come Saturday. I spent that week doing ordinary things. Watering the tomatoes in the backyard. The season was nearly over, but I had a few stragglers. Reorganizing the pantry, which didn't need organizing but gave my hands something to do. I read in the evenings. I walked to the end of the block and back each morning, which Franklin and I used to do together, and which I still did alone, because stopping felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. On Friday evening, Raymond came by to go over the documents. He sat at the kitchen table in his careful, unhurried way, and we went through everything together. The trust structure, the property holdings, the development offer, the provisions Franklin had written. "You know she's going to feel blindsided," Raymondson said. "I know. And Derek is going to immediately start calculating." "I know that too." Raymond looked at me over his glasses. "You sure about this?" I thought about Lauren at that table laughing, the comfortable ease of it, how unself-conscious she'd been, the way you're only unself-conscious when something has become habit. "Franklin created this trust to be used," I said. "I think it's time." Lauren and Derek arrived at noon on Saturday. Lauren brought a coffee cake from a bakery in Nashville, which I knew was her way of softening whatever she thought might be coming. Derek wore a fleece vest and khakis, the weekend costume of men who've stopped having to impress anyone locally. I'd set the kitchen table with 3 cups, and the good napkins, the linen ones I saved for company. When they came in, Lauren looked around the kitchen the way she always did when she came home. A quick scan, half habit, half audit. Checking for signs of decline, I think, though she'd never admit that. "You look good, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek. "Sit down," I said. "I'll pour the coffee." We made small talk for about 10 minutes. Derek mentioned the drive, the construction on I-24, something about a project at his firm. Lauren cut the coffee cake into pieces and put them on the little plates I'd set out. The morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that lit up the dust motes and made everything look both ordinary and final. Then I put Raymond's folder on the table. Lauren looked at it. "What's this?" "Your father's estate documents," I said. "Some of them, anyway. The ones I need you to understand." Derek leaned forward slightly. That particular kind of forward. I walked them through it the same way Raymond had walked me through it 3 years earlier. The properties first. The locations, the approximate valuations, the years Franklin had held them. I watched Lauren's face change in stages. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like vertigo. Dad owned all of this, she said. He did, and you knew. I knew some of it. Raymond managed the rest. Your father was. You know how he was. Private. Derek was very still in a way that reminded me of a hunting dog that scented something. What's the current valuation? I told him. Lauren put her hand flat on the table. Mom, I know it's a lot to take in. A lot too. She stopped. She pressed her fingers against her mouth briefly, the way she did when she was trying to compose herself. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't Dad tell me? I folded my hands in my lap. Because he was afraid, I said. Not of you specifically, of what the knowledge might do. To you, to your marriage, to how you moved through the world. I paused. He wanted you to build your own life first. To know who you were before you knew what you'd inherit. She was quiet for a long moment. Derek cleared his throat. So the development offer. Raymond is handling it, I said. That's not why I told you. Derek looked up. Then why? I looked at my daughter, who was staring at the table with her hands folded in her lap in a posture that, I suddenly realized, was identical to mine. Because of dinner last Saturday, I said quietly. The room got very still. Lauren's eyes came up slow. Mom, you told your colleagues I clip coupons and buy shoes at Goodwill. My voice remained even. As a punchline, while I was sitting at the end of the table. I paused. I need you to understand who your father was, Lauren. What he built and how, and why. Not so you feel guilty about the money. So you understand what you were laughing at. Lauren's jaw tightened. For a moment I thought she was going to argue, the way she used to when she was 16 and cornered. Then something in her face shifted. I didn't think you heard, she said finally. I heard. A silence. I wasn't trying to be cruel, she said. Her voice was smaller now. I know that, I said. That's what worried me most. Derek started to say something. Lauren put her hand on his arm without looking at him, and he stopped. Goodwill, she said softly, more to herself than to me. You have all of this and you shop at Goodwill. Some things, yes. She looked up. Her gray-green eyes, Franklin's eyes, were bright. Why? I thought about how to answer. Because I know what it cost, I said. Not in dollars. In hours. In years of brown bag lunches and driving used cars and saying no to things that didn't matter, so we could eventually say yes to things that did. I touched the edge of the folder. Your father didn't build this to show anyone anything. He built it because he wanted us to be safe. He wanted you to be safe. He just wasn't sure you'd receive it the right way, and I'm not sure I was either, until last Saturday. Lauren looked at me for a long time, then, very quietly, she said, I've been ashamed of where we came from. It wasn't a question. I know, I said, since I was in college. Her voice was flat and honest in a way I hadn't heard in years. People would ask where I was from, and I'd say Nashville instead of Murfreesboro because Nashville sounded more. She stopped. And then I married Derek and everything just got bigger, and I kept moving the line of what was acceptable to admit. Derek said her name quietly. She shook her head at him. She deserves honesty, Lauren said, not harshly, just plainly. I owe her that much. The coffee had gone cold. I got up to pour fresh cups, and for a few minutes there was just the sound of the coffee maker, and the birds outside, and the particular silence of things that have been said and cannot be unsaid. When I sat back down, Lauren asked, What happens now? With the estate, the development offer, what do you want to do? Raymond and I are proceeding with the sale, I said. The trust remains in my name for now. What I do with it after that depends. I looked at her, partly on you. She absorbed that. I'm not punishing you, I said. I want to be clear about that. I know, but I'm also not going to hand things to someone who's embarrassed by them. I said it gently, but I said it. Your father left provisions for bringing you into the trust. Whenever I felt ready. Whenever I felt confident. I paused. I've been watching for 4 years, Lauren. Waiting to see who you were going to be. She looked stricken. And last Saturday answered that. Last Saturday clarified it, I said. There's a difference. Clarified means there's still something to work with. Derek was quiet in a way that felt genuine rather than strategic. Something about the morning had stripped the performances away from him too. I didn't know what she was growing up with, he said after a moment. Dorothy, I mean that. She never told me much. I filled in the blanks myself and I didn't fill them in fairly. No, I agreed. You didn't. I'm sorry for that. I looked at him. There was something in his face, not quite humility, but the first door opening toward it. Thank you, Derek. The afternoon passed slowly and honestly, the way important afternoons do. Lauren asked me about the properties, where they were, when Franklin had bought them, what he'd said about them. I told her what I knew. She asked about Raymond, about how the trust worked, about what Franklin's actual intentions had been. I told her about the provision, the one that said only when you're confident she'll receive it as a gift rather than an entitlement. That's very Dad, she said, and her voice broke a little on the last word. Yes. He was always watching, she said, quietly. You both were. That's what parents do, I said. At least the ones who love you more than they need credit. Lauren reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was tight, the way it used to be when she was small and we crossed parking lots. I'm sorry, Mom. Her eyes were wet. For Saturday, for the 10 years before Saturday, for all of it. I know, I said. I don't know how to fix it. You can't fix it, I said. You can just start making different choices. I squeezed her hand. That's all any of us can do. We ate the coffee cake eventually, though it was a little dry by then. Derek washed the cups without being asked, which I noticed. Lauren helped me water the tomatoes in the backyard, crouching down in her nice weekend clothes to look at the last of the little red ones still clinging to the vine. Remember when I made you grow tomatoes in the backyard? I said. When you were 8. You said if I grew them myself, I'd eat them. She smiled. I still don't really like tomatoes. I know, you ate them anyway every summer. She looked up at me. I didn't want to disappoint you. Lauren, I said, you never disappointed me by eating tomatoes. Or not eating them. She stood up and straightened her jacket and looked at the small yard. The garden beds Franklin had built, the wooden bench he'd made from a kit, the bird feeder he'd painted red. I keep thinking about what it costs, she said quietly. To pretend you came from somewhere you didn't. What does it cost? She considered the question seriously, the way I remembered her doing as a little girl when she thought an answer deserved more than a quick response. Yourself, mostly, she said finally. I thought that was about the wisest thing she'd said in a long while. They left in the early evening, the long Tennessee dusk, turning the sky amber behind the tree line. Lauren hugged me at the door. A real hug this time, both arms, no sideways economy to it. Can I call you Wednesday? She asked. Not Sunday, Wednesday. Something warm moved through my chest. I'll be here, I said. I stood on the porch and watched their car until it turned the corner. Then I went inside to the kitchen, poured the last of the coffee, and sat at the table where Raymond had sat with that folder, where Lauren had sat with her hand, pressed flat to the wood in shock, where Franklin had sat for 38 years of ordinary mornings and everything that was built inside them. That was 8 months ago. Lauren calls on Wednesdays now, and Sundays, sometimes both. We've had dinner 3 times since then, here at the house, not Nashville, not a rooftop restaurant with white linen and people who need managing. Just my kitchen table, and whatever I've made, and Lauren sitting close enough that our elbows touch when we reach for things at the same time. The development sale closed in January. Raymond called to give me the final number, and I sat very quietly on the phone for a moment, and then I said thank you. And we talked about Franklin for a while, which we do sometimes now, because Raymond knew him in ways I didn't, and that's a gift. I brought Lauren into the trust 2 months ago. Raymond drew up the papers at that same kitchen table, sun coming through the window, coffee in the blue ceramic mug. Lauren signed her name carefully. When she looked up, her eyes were wet again. Dad put this together for me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. For both of us, I said. He was always thinking about both of us. She nodded slowly. Derek is doing better too, I think. He started a habit of asking me questions when we're together. Real questions about Franklin, about the early years, about Murfreesboro. And I've decided to take it at face value, because it's easier to build something on good faith than to spend the rest of your life testing the foundation. Last month, Lauren called me on a Wednesday and said one of her colleagues had asked about her mother. What did you tell them? I asked. A small pause. That you live in Murfreesboro, that you garden and volunteer and buy good things secondhand, because you know what things are actually worth. Another pause. That you're the most quietly powerful person I've ever known. I didn't say anything for a moment. She asked if she could meet you sometime, Lauren added. She sounds like good people. She is, Lauren said. Sort of like you. I don't know what Franklin would say if he could see us now. Something quietly satisfied, probably. He never needed to say much when things were going right. He'd just look around at a table full of people eating and talking too loud, and he'd get that particular expression. Not a grin, just a certain settling of his face, a contentment so deep it looked almost like rest. I think about him at odd moments. Standing at the stove, driving to the church pantry on Thursday mornings, sitting on the bench in the backyard he built from a kit. I talk to him sometimes, which I used to feel sheepish about and don't anymore. I tell him about the trust, about the sale, about Lauren calling Wednesdays. I tell him that Emma from the bakery finally got the storefront she'd been saving for. I tell him the tomatoes came back better this year. And sometimes, in the early morning when the light comes through the curtains, and the house is quiet, and the blue ceramic mug is warm in my hands, I tell him what I think he'd most want to know. That our daughter is finding her way back to herself. That it cost something, as real things always do. That she's learning what he always knew. That wealth is just a tool, and the question is never how much you have, but what you're willing to build with it, and who you're willing to love along the way. He always knew the right things to hold on to. I'm glad, in the end, that I learned from him.